Let's now welcome Professor Ravi Kumar, the Shaw Chair Professor and Associate Provost, Special Projects from Nanyang Technological University to give us the welcome remarks. Dr. Ravi, please.
Good morning. As mentioned, I'm Ravi Kumar. I had the pleasure of, with Ambassador here, to start the Center for African Studies 4 years ago. Shabir was the prime driver of that, and I've been fortunate to work with him in starting up the center, which is a conduit of education and networking between Southeast Asia, with Singapore as a hub, and African businesses as such. The focus of the center is to create knowledge in the space of Africa, Southeast Asia relationships, and we have been doing that for the last 3 years, and we've been very successful. Our relationship with SBF, it is called the SBF NTU Center, and it is very important for us because this center was placed in the business school, not in other areas of the university, and so it is important for us to partner with the Singapore Business Federation to create value for the business audience in Singapore, and to bring in experts on Africa to Singapore to educate us and to create value for us. Today we are very happy to have Dr. Hengari. He is the visiting research fellow of NTU-SBF at our Center for African Studies. He was here last week at IE Singapore talking about the role of regional free trade agreements and its impact for Africa and the development of Africa as such. Today, he's going to be talking about the investment from outside Africa coming in, which is what I used to know as the One Belt, One Road initiative, now called the BRI, which is the Belt Road Initiative, and also the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor for Africa, the initiative by from that initiative also in Africa, and what the opportunities for business development here in Africa. We will also have a panel after Dr. Hengari's presentation to discuss this initiative of how business development is going to occur on the basis of this investment. It'll be led by Dr. Adi, who's a research fellow at the NTU-SBF Center for African Studies. He'll be joined by Dr. Hengari, Mr. Ranveer Chauhan, who is the Managing Director and CEO of Olam International in the Edible Oils and Natural Rubber Division. Dr. Zhang Hongzhou, from our research fellow at our China programs in the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and Mr. Johan Berger, who's our director for the NTU SBF Center for African Studies. Without any further delay, Dr. Hengari. Please join me now.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Professor, for the introduction and the kind welcome remarks. Let me thank the NTU-SBF Center for African Studies for hosting me for the past 2 weeks. The experience has been extremely rewarding and enriching. For today, for this morning, rather, I have the unenviable task of talking to 5 themes. They're compressed in 40 minutes. I'll try to make them accessible in as far as they catalyze business activity in Africa. So I chose to break them down a bit in order to manage them. I'm proceeding in this manner because I don't know if I'm correct, but the Jidai Yilu, the One Belt, One Road, and the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, and their interactions with Africa as a price taker, and not necessarily as an active participant, can be distilled in those 5 significant parts. I think from where I stand or sit, these are useful lenses for business. I shall not get into the greater details of each, only in a very cursory manner, because I only have about 40 minutes or so. But I think their own dynamics, when you look at them that way, they are an essential backdrop through which businesses should interpret the opportunities in OBOR as a larger construct, as well as the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. That's I think I'm present that in French, but that is how I will proceed in terms of the macro anchors that underpin both the OBOR-Africa relationship as well as the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor as an initiative. I think you cannot understand what China is doing in Africa without the bilateral China-Africa relationship. You can also not understand the emergence of the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor without looking at Japan in Africa through the TIGAD initiatives. And secondly, the India-Africa Forum Summits. I think these are useful lenses in order to sort of understand the 2 larger constructs, which are OBOR as well as the AAGC. Now let me specifically turn to this partnership. And I think what has been the most penetrating one is without doubt the Africa-China partnership. And basically launched through the FOCAC initiatives from the late 1990s. I think my colleagues later during the panel, I'm sure they will be able to fill some of the gaps that might be obvious from my presentation, because they've done interesting work in the areas of business and so forth. But I'll try and speak from sort of a larger conceptual angle. China has, as I'd mentioned, transformed Africa significantly. And OBOR is likely to reinforce the same trends. There's no doubt about it. Even though it has received some very mixed reactions as a broader construct. I chose these 2, what I found to be quite interesting in as far as OBOR is concerned. The second one in particular, because it talks about, the first one in particular, because it talks about the project as a means of encircling the world with the One Belt. And I think there are many different interpretations around that, there's no doubt about it. But I thought it just, to highlight the extent and the depth of the debate around OBOR globally. There's no doubt, it has received a lot of attention as a consequence. I shall not elaborate too much on OBOR because I think it is really known here in Singapore. Last week, I think it was on the 28th of August, the Minister for Home Affairs and Law, I think that's what he's referred to as Minister K. Shanmugam, spoke quite eloquently about at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in a speech titled "The One Belt, One Road Initiative: Impact and Implications," in which he raised the question of challenges and opportunities for Singapore. It was quite a lengthy presentation, but his findings are quite illuminating, especially for businesses in Singapore. Of course, he limited his presentation to some of the macro issues and specifically the opportunities for Singapore. But I think it's worth, without doubt, it's worth consulting. Africa, when you look at it within the OBOR construct, but it's a tiny piece, I think. It's a tiny piece. It is not part of what is, I mean, geographically speaking, it's also impossible. It's not part of the juicy part, which is the belt. But it's more within the road, connecting with Athens, Venice, and Calcutta on the other side. China has identified 65 countries along OBOR, and they will be home to hundreds of projects bearing the stamp. When you look at OBOR closely, it is really it's a moving object. Depending on the sources that you consult, you'll find different interpretations. But when you look at the 65 countries, 64 plus 1, Africa is really underrepresented. Africa is really underrepresented. I found only African country in the 65. I think it was Egypt in the 65. So I don't know what that means, but in some of the sources, for example, on the website of the Hong Kong Trade Council, Ethiopia is listed as one of the OBOR countries, but most of the conversations would say, well, you know, the OBOR countries in Africa would be Djibouti, Kenya, and Egypt. So you have, I mean, it's really a moving object. I think that clearly illustrates what I've been trying to say. That's a slide from Jeune Afrique, and that is, unfortunately it's in French, but that is how it interprets OBOR in Africa. So it's largely on the eastern, northern part of the African continent. But you would have some maps of this nature that would sort of create connectivities within the African hinterland, talking about OBOR as well. So, but I think, as I mentioned, it's still a moving object. But its goals, I think, are worth highlighting. One, it's looking at policy coordination. Two, it's facilities connectivity. Three, unimpeded trade. Four, financial integration. And E, people-to-people bonds. I think there's also something worth highlighting that I think that sort of, I don't know if it's a cold shower on our expectations, but Africa is also absent from the 6 corridors that are crucial anchors in the Belt and Road Initiative. But I think what is worth emphasizing at this point is the larger picture within the China-Africa relationship operates. It has been widely commented in terms of its impact, infrastructure, and so forth. The trade between Africa and China that has increased exponentially since 2000, and it's currently picking up after what we really saw as almost a few years of bad economic activity within the African continent as a result of the slowdown of the Chinese economy. China's Ministry of Commerce earlier this year released a statement about a Sino-African trade that is on the increase by 16.8% between the first semester of 2017 and 2016. What is quite impressive, if I may put it that way, is the fact that the increase was largely a result of an increase in African exports to China, which is listed by the Commerce Ministry as having increased by 46% over that period. Senegal, South Africa, Djibouti were the biggest beneficiary. So in terms of the overall picture, the only country there, again, depending on which map you are looking at, would be Djibouti. And I also saw in one of them that South Africa was also now framed as one of the overall countries. So that is where China-Africa trade is coming from. I don't need to emphasize that. Of course, the balance is, as you can see, is in favor of China. But the reality is that African countries have benefited immensely in terms of trading opportunities with China. That is understandable. So Obo, with its huge demands for infrastructure, is likely to increase economic activity in Africa. And currently China is putting about 13 billion US dollars annually in African infrastructure, which is quite consequential when you look at the fact that according to the World Bank, Africa will need about 90 billion US dollars for the next 10 years, I think, on infrastructure spend and maintenance in order to sort of meet its needs. Now let me turn to the second aspect, which is Japan, Africa through TIGAD. Last year, Japan hosted the 6th TIGAD conference in Nairobi, in Kenya. I think it was in August, under 3 themes: promoting structural economic transformation through economic diversification and industrialization, promoting resilient health systems for quality of life, promoting social stability for shared prosperity. Those were the 3 themes under which Japan hosted the 6th TIGAD conference in Kenya, Nairobi. At the forum, a Japan and Africa Public-Private Economic Forum was established. It's also worth mentioning here that the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, accompanied by 73 or 77 businessmen, depending on which report you read, signed several memorandums of understanding with African countries, about 22 Japanese companies and institutions with 20 African countries and 6 organizations. Some of these Japanese companies include blue chip, such as Toyota, Sumitomo, NEC, and so forth. The PM of Japan, in addition to pledges for other sectors such as health, also made the promise to invest $10 billion in Africa by 2018 in the infrastructure and energy sectors. So that is by the end of next year, Japan would have possibly lived up to its promise of $10 billion investment in infrastructure, in African infrastructure and energy. The PM also urged at the same conference the private sector to invest a further $20 billion. I think what I'm trying to emphasize here is the scale of the ambition, the scale of the ambitions of Japan as an actor in Africa. And I think Japan is coming from a very, very low base when you look at it. It doesn't have a lot of FDI stock in Africa. When you look at the changes with China at 252, in terms of percentage, Japan is quite low at 74. So I think the country that is coming from a low base and it's seeking it's trying to make significant improvements from that very low base. I think it's a very, very, very interesting picture when you look at it very closely. Now the last, maybe not the last, but the third actor is the India-Africa Forum Summit. Earlier this year, the African Development Bank held its annual meeting in India. And at that meeting, there was a paper presented that sort of framed, in a way, Africa-India cooperation with the objective of consolidating partnerships to industrialize and move Africa up the value chains. India is also coming from quite a low position, but nonetheless, bilateral trade between Africa and India has risen fivefold in the decade over the past 10 years, from 11.9 billion in 2005, 2006 to 56.7 billion in 2015, 2016. India's imports from Africa have also increased sevenfold, from 4.9 billion in 2005, 2006 to 31 billion in 2015, 2016. So it is clear that India has also been a significant opportunity for African trade. And Africa, I think, when you look at all these countries, Africa's share of India's trade, of India's imports, stands at 8.3%, which is quite interesting, and if not impressive. Of course, I mean, we are quite aware that most of Africa's exports into these markets are in the form of raw material, and the challenge is to move up the value chain. And I think the fact that already trade or African exports are increasing into these markets, it provides opportunities for businesses that seeks to invest in the value chain. India has largely focused for many years in its relationship on capacity building, but it has also, through the Exim Bank, extended significant lines of credit, which includes a total of 137 projects in 41 countries. And these are in different sectors: shipping, technology, irrigation, agriculture, roads and transport, and so forth. That is the, I want to get into the sort of the conversation around the AAGC. And I think partly that slide would explain why both India and Japan would think seriously about upscaling their interactions with Africa. They've not been doing too well compared to China as far as trade with the continent is concerned. You can see Japan is well below 20 billion US dollars, even though it's the world's third largest economy. China is the second largest economy, is sitting at currently 220 billion US dollars. India is still in the 40s billion dollars. So the AAGC should be seen within the context of not only the geopolitics that we all know, but also in terms of the opportunity that Africa represents for these two countries in order to lock Africa into the Asian frontier as well, because the AAGC is, when compared to OBOR, is still infant. Not much is out yet. It is still at the level of intention. It was only, it started to be conceptualized last year. I think it was October, and earlier this year at the African Development Bank meetings in India, both Japan and India decided to intensify the AAGC, which is anchored around 4 aspects: development and cooperation, quality infrastructure and institutional connectivity, enhancing capacities and skills in Africa in the partnership, as well as focusing on people-to-people exchanges. And I think it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting to see that there is explicit reference to quality infrastructure, because I think it's sort of it's maybe aimed at some of the accusations that have been leveled against China in Africa. It's providing poor quality infrastructure for African countries. So Japan and India, through the AAGC, is promising to do better for African countries. Another, I think it's in terms of the funding mechanisms those are still to emerge, but the Prime Minister of Japan recently promised to pump about 200 billion US dollars into emerging Asian and African markets. And according to the Japan Times, that is likely to be sort of the part of the seed capital for the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, 200 billion US dollars, as opposed to, I think, about 124 billion that is in the Obor Kitty. Based on what I've just raised, I think there are certain broad conclusions that we can make. And these have important implications for business seeking to invest through Obor as well as the AAGC frameworks. You have three major economies that have put their bets on Africa through very ambitious interactions. And that somehow crystallizes the African rising narrative, a continent that is moving in the right direction on all the indicators, really. Political stability, macroeconomic management, an emerging middle class, and significant infrastructure investments. I think that's the first conclusion we can make, and from which a business should look at both Obor and the AAGC in as far as the African frontier is concerned. The second conclusion that I made is that Obor and AAGC are not only economic initiatives, they are major geopolitical constructs. There's no doubt about that. The AAGC is a response to Obor, and that makes it quite political. And when you look at the scale of its ambitions in terms of the connectivities in Asia and Africa, the corridors that are being thought about, they speak to also potential challenges as far as dealing with all the countries along those corridors. And the same with Obor. They are political constructs. So one cannot, as a business, one cannot take a very blanket view of what they can offer. I think maybe you might have to proceed on a case-by-case basis. There's no doubt about that. And I think it speaks to the diversity of the different countries along the belts, the political situations. I mean, these risks, they are legal and financial challenges when it comes to accessing these markets. The third conclusion that I make here is that, which is optimistic as opposed to the second one. Both Obor and the AAGC, especially Obor, which is fairly advanced, offer opportunities in terms of potentially new business models in the value chain for those seeking opportunities in Africa. If Africa is increasing its exports into some of these markets, I think that provides opportunities for companies that have advanced in the production value chain to also seek investments in Africa. The The fourth and final conclusion that I would want to make here, in as far as these two constructs is concerned, and also the bilateral frameworks that I discussed earlier, is the fact that they promise new financing mechanisms through different models. And I think it is now widely concluded that the challenge of doing business in Africa is no longer money. There's enough money to, I think, to do business. It's a question of creativity and accessing the resources through some of the models that have been proposed in both Obor as well as now what is emerging through the AAGC, and also the existing financial resources that have been availed by Japan, India, as well as China. So I think, you know, it's a bit, as I had mentioned in my disclaimer at the beginning, it's quite a massive subject. So I try to compress it in a manner that is slightly chaotic, but I think there's a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hengari. So now could we have the panel discussion and our esteemed panelists to come up to the table here. Dr. Hengari, the Visiting Research Fellow from NTU-SBF Center for African Studies. Mr. Ranbir Chauhan, Managing Director and CEO, Edible Oils and Natural Rubber Division, Olam International Limited. Mr. Zhang Hongzhou, Research Fellow, China Program, as Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and Mr. Johan Berger, Director, the NTU-SBF Center for African Studies of NTU. So also for the session today, Dr. Folake will be the moderator. She's the Research Fellow of NTU-SBF Center for African Studies. So during this session, we'll take on questions and we'll have my colleagues to pass you the mic. So before you have your questions, you could put up your hands and let us know your name and your organization. Thank you.
Good morning, all. It's a privilege for me to moderate this esteemed and far-reaching thinkers. I'm just going to very, very quickly introduce the panel. I know that Professor Ravi has done a little bit of the introduction, but I'm just going to pick on a few things. We have just heard from Dr. Alfredo. It's easier to say Alfredo. And he's given a talk really on the subject that we are going to be discussing today. Dr. Alfredo is a political scientist and a public intellectual, and we really are delighted to have you as a visiting fellow at the Center for African Studies. Next to Alfredo is Mr. Zhang Hongzhou. Hongzhou is a research fellow with the China program at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. His research includes China and regional resources, security, food, water, and energy. He's co-author along with Dr. Feng Shi, also from the Institute. And they've written, there's a publication on China Global Quest for Resources, Energy, Food, and Water. On my right is Mr. Ranbir Chauhan. He's a seasoned businessman with over 27 years of experience in agri-commodities. He's the managing director and CEO of Edible Oils and Natural Rubber Division, Olam. He's a genuine lover of Africa. And as you probably know here, he's no stranger to many of you. He's also written a book along with Mr. M.D. Raman, Amazing Africa, A Corporate Journey. And last, but certainly not the least, is Mr. Johan Berger, my boss and director, of the NTU-SBF Center for African Studies. Johan is an academic and businessman at heart. He's been involved in a number of business initiatives. His research is on Africa. He looks at the macro environment, the business environment, the risks, the opportunities, the trends. He really is the brain behind many of the initiatives carried out by the center in a bid to position us as the premier think tank on Africa. He's editor of Friday at Noon, a weekly electronic newsletter for the Southeast Asian community. So having kind of done that introduction, I will briefly talk about the subject at hand. The BRI and the AAGC as stimulants for business development in Africa. Dr. Alfredo has said quite a bit, and as he said, on this panel, we will fill in some of the gaps. In 2013, President Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as the BRI. It refers to the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, which seeks to connect 65 countries, an estimated 4.4 billion people, depending on the reports you read, across 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, essentially to promote economic cooperation. And key areas of BRI are connectivity, transport, finance services, and trade. Now for Africa, the focus is on the Maritime Silk Road. And Alfredo was quick to point out the fact that Africa really has no connection with the belt, the 6 corridors. According to the Hong Kong Trade Development Council, Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Africa are belt and road countries. And you can see Alfredo kind of highlighting the fact that it's really hard to know which countries in Africa, really fall under the belt. It really depends on sort of where you go. But there are, for example, the Hong Kong Trade Development Council is one of those ones. Like Alfredo said, it's a moving belt, and they try and keep up with it. So it really just depends on when you get there and what you see. President Kenyatta of Kenya and the Prime Minister of Ethiopia were participants at the One Belt, One Road Summit in May 2017. There was a lot of publicity around that area. Ministers from Egypt and Tunisia were also present. And very recently, Egypt signed, they came up with a statement with China, basically highlighting the importance of promoting the BRI. Okay, so I think they get the sense of you got to see other countries taking part and being involved in it with you. In May 2017, India launched the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor Initiative at the African Development Bank meeting in Gujarat. It's, as we have already heard, it's an initiative between Japan and India, and it really wants to develop infrastructure and digital connectivity. Alfredo has told us what those 4 pillars are, and I'm sure maybe other parts of the panel will talk about that at some point. But I now want to talk about the objectives of this panel. It's to gain key insights into BRI and AAGC and how they compare with each other, to understand the challenges each face, and to gather understanding of business opportunities available. Now, I have asked the panel to prepare a short presentation, about 5 to 7 minutes long, on the challenges and business opportunities of both the BRI and the AAGC. Alfredo has touched on quite a few of them as well in his presentation. But before I hand over to the floor, I want to start a quick survey, and I want to kind of engage with you, the audience, because you form a very crucial part of this panel discussion. So please, with a quick show of hands, how many people currently have business or other engagements in Africa? Can we just have a show of hands? If you have business engagements, okay, all right. And how many people are not currently engaged in Africa, but you have specific plans to engage in Africa? Okay, so then the others are, okay, we'll see how that goes. Okay, okay, can I encourage you to think about your stories involving Africa engagement or potential Africa engagement, and pose your questions to our distinguished panelists during the question and answer session. Now, I am going to make sure they finish on time. Okay, so there is a Q&A section from 12 to 12:30, and we're going to make full use of it. Okay, so what I'm just going to do now is I'm now going to ask the panelists to give their presentations, and I'm going to start with Ranveer.
Good morning. Dr. Fulaki, thank you. You caught me by surprise by naming me first to speak on the panel, but I guess it is good for all of us. I landed today morning from a long flight from Mozambique, and I run the risk, if I stay quiet, of sleeping on my chair. I would like to draw a little bit of perspective to this topic today of BRI and AAGC. I had to lean a lot on my good friend Johan to really understand what these two topics, what is the available research on these, and you will hear from him directly. As our the keynote speaker today mentioned about BRI, it is not designed for Africa. China has got global ambitions, and if you, even in the BRI, if you look at it, it has its own direct and very strong connections south of China towards Southeast Asia and right up till Australia. It has got strong ambitions of connecting through new routes right across to Europe. Those two are the important axes. It is reaching into Middle East and touching Africa. In Africa also, it has chosen Djibouti, which is sitting right on the Suez route. So a very strategic position. We will know that Djibouti is the first military base of China in a global scenario. We are used to hearing about US having military bases. They must be having at least 5 of them across in Africa itself. So it is first of China's stance. So this is China's global plan and not really Africa specific. While the AAGC, as the name suggests, is India and Japan joining hands for developing a program specifically towards Africa. Before we start comparing them and the implication of Africa, I would like to draw us back a few decades. The kind of investment that the European countries and US have made into Africa, and that infrastructure of policy and trade policy and connections that they have put in place. Europe had the advantage of a few centuries of very close relations, political and business, on the continent. And you will realize that infrastructure is the secondary. The hard infrastructure of roads and connectivity comes second. The first is about language. So Europe holds that key infrastructure on ground. US built upon it after the World War and invested hugely. If you look at the presence of USAID and this new program of AGOA, AGOA, by now we have forgotten about it. The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act was started in the year 2000. They have been working on it since then. And the focus of that program is to create access in the US market for African products. And they have now expanded it to continue till 2025. So those are the platforms that we should really compare BRI and AAGC with to see how do they measure up. BRI is not specific to Africa, but it will have an impact. China is already invested in Africa, and you can see its influence coming into the infrastructure projects. Other development projects like housing for the parliament, the MP houses in many countries, airports. Those are not gifts. Those are long-term loans and other arrangements. Other arrangements include investing in these assets for the country in exchange for mining rights and other commercial interests. India and Japan are more hesitant. They are much more commercial in their commitments and their programs. Between the two, we will draw a distinction for India. It has a long history in Africa of having its own people of Indian origin based in Africa and living in Africa with now African nationalities for so many years. I will just close my comments by these 4 comparisons again. AGOA, the US program. EU does not have a specific named program, but it has got widespread presence across Africa, variety of programs, developmental aid, financial, infrastructure programs, government aid, BRI, and now AAGC. I'm sure Johan will explain further that China and India's engagement to Africa goes beyond these 2 acronyms that we are discussing today. My own doubt that remains from the business point of view, how do we connect these policies, the government-to-government policies, to really impact business interactions? And through that, the lives of day-to-day people, either investors from Asia into Africa or the people living in Africa. How do these really impact? Personally, I don't see too much of that. OLAM has got a widespread presence in Africa, and I do not see the impact of AAGC or BRI directly into the business environment. I see those airports, and I use them many times. Even the Mozambique, the Maputo airport is built by Chinese money over the past 3-4 years. Wonderful facilities coming up, but how do they exactly impact my business? How do they make it easier? How do they make it easier for the Africans to do business and live lives basis new jobs and economic prospects? I will be happy to understand through the panel interaction today. Thank you.
Pass it to you, Hongzhou.
Thank you very much. Just now, I think what I like the most from Dr. Alfredo's presentation is that he brought up the concept that BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is a moving object, which to me make perfect sense because it is exactly the reason because the moving object creates so many misperceptions and confusions, even not only outside China, but also within China. So first of all, I will briefly talk about how this concept has evolved since 2013. Originally, the Belt and Road Initiative was separately known as the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. It was considered top diplomatic initiative with a focus on economic cooperation. It's kind of similar like the new Silk Road of the United States in Central Asia and Afghanistan, and the Lower Mekong initiative in Southeast Asia. The Silk Road Economic Belt, which was actually promulgated by the Department of European and Central Asian Affairs under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road was introduced or formulated by the Department of Asia under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So when the two concept or two strategy was first introduced, they were discussed, mentioned separately. Only by mid-2014, when with internal discussion and also interaction with the outside world, the top leadership and also the government began to realize that the Belt and Road Initiative, or Belt and Road, the two strategies offer can be the solution to many of the domestic and international and many of the domestic and external problems faced China today, including excess capacity, the use of RMB, and also some of the political and security challenges faced China. As a result, the Belt and Road Initiative was significantly expanded and upgraded, and eventually by the late 2014, it became a kind of both domestic and international undertaking. It can be compared to Deng Xiaoping's opinion reform in 1948. So it has both domestic and international component. Right now, if you look at the Chinese Chinese official documents, domestically, the Belt and Road Initiative is considered one of the grand economic strategies under Chinese President Xi Jinping. The other two include the Yangtze Economic Belt and the integrated development plans of Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei. And internationally, is part of China's grand foreign policy. The Chinese strategists often call it 2 legs and 1 circle. So the other two is the great new types major power relation and friendly neighbor policies. We talk a lot about how Belt and Road Initiative is being developed outside China, but internally is very important. And if you look at is actually right now perhaps the most important game in town. You have all the ministries, departments formulated their own Belt and Road plans. All provincial governments has identified Belt and Road as the key focus of their work in 2017. Not only the provincial government level, if you look at the cities, the counties, even at the town level, they have all kinds of, they try their best to plug in to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative based on their own competitive advantages and their own geographic locations. And the second point, let me move on to the scopes. Even in terms of scope, is a moving object. Dr. Alfredo, as mentioned earlier, the Chinese government, at least some officially affiliated think tanks, identify 65 countries. Only one country, Egypt, is included. But now, if you look at the list, it's expanded to 69, including not only Egypt, but also Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti. But the official, if you look at the speech by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it says open to all countries. And one of the most significant points is that, of course, just now, previous speakers mentioned African countries is not a key focus of Belt and Road countries, perhaps except East Africa. And also, Africa is not really included in the 6 economic corridors identified by China. But it doesn't really matter in the case from the Chinese perspective. I mean, from the practical point of view, whether it's included in the 6 economic corridors or not, is not really a big deal. For instance, if you look at one of the 6 economic corridors, the Bangladesh, China, India, and Myanmar economic corridor, apparently is not moving anywhere. India has officially, openly rejected the Belt and Road Initiative, and the relationship between Myanmar and Bangladesh is so bad that the two countries don't even talk to each other. How can you expect this economic corridor to move forward? But on the other hand, if you look at the plans from the Ministry of Agriculture, for instance, as a part of Ministry of Agriculture's Belt and Road Plan, in April 2017, it approved plans to establish 10 international agriculture demonstration zones in 10 countries. Among these 10 international agriculture demonstration zones, 3 are in Africa, 1 in Sudan, 1 in Mozambique, and 1 in Zambia. Those 3 countries are not officially included in the Belt and Road Plans initiative, at least as we know right now. And the next point, let me talk about some of the benefits the Belt and Road Initiative can bring to Asia, to this part of the world and Africa. First of all, of course, the infrastructure is high on the list. Asia and African developing countries need a lot of financial resources to develop the infrastructure sectors, and China has a lot to offer. Since a lot has been discussed, I will just skip that. And the second point is agriculture. I think this is not really frequently discussed, but has become a major part of China's Belt and Road Plans, especially coincides with China's reform into the country's food security strategy. In late 2013 and early 2014, China redefined its food security strategy. In the past, the food security strategy for China is about achieving 95% self-sufficiency in grain. However, since then, it adopted a new strategy called domestic production with moderate imports. So the first time ever, China officially include utilization of agricultural resources as part of its food security strategy. And since then, various efforts has been put to encourage Chinese companies and agencies to expand cooperation in other countries in agriculture and food sectors. And in 2015, the term, overall tone is still about encouraging cooperation with other foreign countries. But in 2016, it mentions that China should cooperate with Belt and Road countries. And in the #1 document in 2017, the whole tone has changed to with Belt and Road countries as a focus, as a priority. China expand cooperations in these regions. And in May 2017, the Ministry of Agriculture formulated the Belt and Road Agriculture Development Vision and Plan. And it was estimated that over 500 billion yuan will be invested in the Belt and Road countries in the coming years in the agriculture and food sectors. So agriculture sector offers huge potentials for China to cooperate with Africa and other Belt and Road countries. Not only those 65 or 67 identified in the list, but in all the countries that has interest, has needs, has potentials to cooperate. And of course, one of the five priority areas identified by Chinese President Xi Jinping is people-to-people connectivity. So hence, one of the benefits is perhaps the arrival of Chinese tourists. In 2016, over 135 million Chinese tourists went overseas with spending about over $261 billion. The expenditure by Chinese tourists has benefited many countries in Asia and the Pacific, notably Japan, Korea, and Thailand. And in a similar trend, the number of arrivals of Chinese tourists in Africa is increasing very rapidly. And Africa is increasingly becoming a popular holiday destinations among the Chinese tourists. The number of arrivals went to Africa increased rapidly due to less visa restrictions and also better connectivities, more flights between China and Africa. For instance, Chinese tourist arrivals in South Africa up by 93% last year. And last point, perhaps the second last point I would like to mention in terms of benefits is manufacturing sector. We have this general impression that the only Chinese interest in South Africa is about resources. In fact, over 30% of Chinese companies that operate in Africa are in the manufacturing sectors. It's the largest components of Chinese companies in Africa. 90% or nearly 90% of the employees are local African people. It is estimated by McKinsey in a report a few months ago, in 2017, that those Chinese companies has created over millions of jobs for African countries. And the total annual production value of the manufacturing sector, the manufacturing plants of the Chinese company reached $500 billion. And the last point I would like to mention is perhaps this is, to me, at least to a lot of observers, is quite debatable, is whether the development approach behind China's Belt and Road Initiative could be the solution to major security and social problems, including terrorism, war, interstate conflicts in Africa. On 15 May, at the Belt and Road Forum, Chinese President, in his opening remark, It declares that, I quote, "Development holds the master key to solving all problems." She said, "Efforts must be made to promote economic development as peace and development are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. The causes of security threats, such as war, conflicts, terrorism, all can be traced to poverty and underdevelopment. As such, relevant solutions are also found in development." Hence, perhaps the bigger question we have to think is whether this development approach can be at least part of the solutions to many of the security, social, and political problems face African countries today. Thank you very much.
Okay, and then I'm going to pass it to Johan.
Thank you, Fulaki. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I asked myself the question, why do we have China on the one hand and India and Japan on the other hand being so interested in Africa? And I think that's the easy part of the equation. Namely that we're sitting with a population of 1.2 billion people, which by 2050 will reach to 2 billion, which by 2100 we're looking at 4 billion people. Massive market. These people need to be fed, they need to be housed, they need to be transported, they need to be provided with middle-class goods. Why middle-class goods? Because the population of Africa is morphing into the middle class. And irrespective of how we define this middle class, whether you look at between $2 and $20 per day disposable income, we're looking between 10 and 100. There's a consumption class in Africa that's growing and it's urbanizing, which provides a nice targeted growth. One of the problems that we do find, or a couple of them in any case, is on the one hand is the fact that Africa up until now, quite a number of the countries have been focusing on exporting of resources, commodities, without looking at beneficiation or value adding. The end result of that was when we had the end of the commodity super cycle, China buying less, a couple of these countries were severely hurt, and they are now looking at other ends. Now, enter the BRI and the AAGC. Let's first talk about the BRI. What is important for me, first of all, is that I see this as an instrument, as an initiative for connectivity and economic development along the countries on the BRI's different routes. So it's about connectivity, which I think is one of the important elements that we're looking at. The second point that I want to look at is we are talking about, and some of the speakers have referred to the fact, that as far as Africa is concerned, the maps, the charts referred to Egypt, Djibouti, Kenya. Is it really only these three countries that will be involved? Or will they be used as link pins or link points for expansion into the continent? That's on the one hand. On the second hand, I think we need to look at the values that the BRI have set them up to be. And it's adopted the UN's Charter's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence in its strategy, namely open for cooperation, harmonious, inclusive, follow market operation, and seek mutual benefit. And as far as Africa is concerned, I think the important element there is the issue of inclusivity. China is not looking at a club. It has so many bilateral and multilateral agreements in place with so many countries in Africa. We saw the figures of trade that Dr. Ngarian has showed us. And if we compare that to India and Japan, it's about half. And if we look at a country such as South Africa, the two combined is 30% of the trade of that of China with South Africa alone. So we find a very dominant position of China in this regard. I think one issue which is also very important that we need to bear in mind is the issue, one of the principles of cooperation, that of financing. Dr. Ngari spoke about the 124 billion, which is seen as a boost for the initiatives of China in Africa in the meeting in May recently. However, that excludes the 100 billion African Asia Investment Bank. No, I lie. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was created in 2015. I mean, we are looking at $100 billion. The BRICS New Development Bank, we're looking at a further $100 billion. We have the US $40 billion of the New Silk Road Fund, which was now again complemented or added upon in May 2017 by a further $14.5 billion. We have the South Climate Cooperation Fund of $3 billion, and then the China Exim Bank agreed in a $1 billion industrialization program with the African Exim Bank. This excludes, ladies and gentlemen, the big four banks in China who are making funds available for the BRI. The China Construction Bank, we're looking at about 15 billion US, the Bank of China at about 3 billion US, and then we have the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China and the Agricultural Bank of China, the amounts of which are not yet known, but are known to be involved in financing activities in Africa. We also see a couple of acquisitions of Chinese companies in countries part of the BRI, which are growing very strongly. In 2016, we had a 31 billion figure, and by mid-August 2017, this figure was $33 billion of Chinese companies rushing into the roads, into the companies which are then involved on the BRI. As I've said, for me, the issue is that of connectivity. It's creating the platforms. We're looking at infrastructure, physical connectivity, including energy. Dr. Ngari spoke about the $90+ billion annually for the next decade or so. That excludes, or includes rather, the $38 billion on the energy infrastructure. IT connectivity, and I'll speak about that now, human connectivity, trade connectivity, and manufacturing connectivity. So far as Africa is concerned, this is something which is of paramount importance for the simple reason that if we look at the intra-Africa trade at this stage of the game, we're talking about 12 to 15%. One of the reasons why this is the case is the lack of connectivity within Africa. Last week we heard at the economic integration session with Dr. Ngari that it is easier and cheaper to export stuff from Africa to other parts of the world than within Africa. Hopefully this infrastructure investment that is getting a massive boost currently from China in East Africa, amongst others. We're looking at rail between Addis and Djibouti. We're looking at rail from Mombasa to Nairobi and further. There's also the link between East Africa from Mombasa right through further East Africa into Central Africa to Cameroon on the west coast of Africa. So the connectivity is there. The principle of inclusivity that I spoke about earlier, the value thereof, or the value of inclusivity, is indicated by this drive. It was based on an MOU between China and the African Union a few years ago. So from this, my point of view is that Africa is not sort of looking at and saying, this is 3 countries and the rest of us will sit back. They are actively looking at how they can benefit. I know companies and institutions in West Africa actively looking at the BRI and seeing this is where we will be getting funding. The president of Togo, amongst others, he's looking at actively participating in the BRI, and that is now on the West Coast. So Africa is not waiting for sort of handouts in this regard. They are looking towards the BRI and say, how can we benefit from this? I made the point early on, actually made a note here rather, that the BRI and the AAGC are not clubs. I do not see them as being mutually exclusive clubs where membership of the one excludes you from membership of the other. These countries are already active in Africa. The figures were mentioned. And I think as far as Africa is concerned, they will be the beneficiaries of investments in infrastructure and in the other areas that I've mentioned. If we look at the infrastructure, I mentioned energy, 38 billion. Let's not go the road of the routes, the route of the roads, rail, ports, and airports, because that is typically large government-to-government contracts and big, large multinational enterprises that get involved. Let's talk about the field of energy. where Africa has a scenario that over 600 million people do not have access to energy, and there's a big potential for investment in energy, if not in the industrial type of coal-fired energy transmission and development of generation and transmission and distribution, then in the renewable energy, where Africa is actively embracing this as the business model of the future, amongst them solar, hydro, wind energy. I'm not even talking about the field of waste to energy, that kind of technology. We have now seen 2 plants, one in Addis, one in Cape Town, where they embrace waste to energy. But if you have a look at the potential, I've spoken a couple of times ago, a month or 2 ago, about the issue of waste to energy in a country such as South Africa, more specifically Johannesburg. It generates 5,000 tons of waste a day. And this is not unique to Johannesburg. However, they are sitting with a hand in their head thinking, where does the next landfill site come from in order to get rid of the waste? Yet waste to energy is not new technology for a country such as Singapore. End of 2015, the Singapore government awarded the 6th contract, or the contract rather, for the 6th WTE plant here in Singapore to Hiflux and Mitsubishi. This is something which Africa really has a big need for, and where there's a great opportunity. So many people, 1.2 billion, I've made the point. In terms of ICT, East Africa is a field where we are looking at the development of technology, digital technology, which is absolutely great. We all know about M-Pesa. We're looking at e-health. We're looking at applications in education, in agriculture. There are so many to mention. In terms of even in West Africa, you have Nigeria looking at Farm Crowdy and Farm Drive, where they're looking at providing applications in the field of agriculture, in the sector of agriculture, linking investors, farmers, and the market to one another. So this kind of activity is something which is available and which I think presents a lot of opportunity for investment. Manufacturing. Ethiopia is one of the, if we look outside of Africa, where South Africa is the major or the most industrialized and the most sophisticated economy in Africa. If you look at a country such as Ethiopia, Ethiopia is in the process of building quite a number of industrial parks where it, with Chinese help, where it is looking at enticing investors to come into Ethiopia, where they would get the benefit of skilled labor at low cost in the fields, amongst others, of textiles. You're looking at other industries such as medical devices, pharmaceutical. Ethiopia, amongst others, is one of those countries which is actively encouraging the generic manufacturers of pharmaceutical medicine to come to Ethiopia and develop it there. In the field of services, education, financial services, tourism, amongst others. It's there with a greater access to infrastructure that is working, road, rail, the greater access of airports, of airlines serving Africa. It increases the potential, and Africa has so much potential and so much to show the rest of the world. Given this broad spectrum, ladies and gentlemen, also in the manufacturing sector, whole value chains are available to exploit, not only on a national basis, but also on a regional basis and on a global basis. My good friend Ranbir next to me, sitting with at Olam, and they are tapping into not only regional, but global value chains. And the opportunity is there. They saw the light a couple of years ago, a couple of decades ago. They're not the only one. All 5 my sponsors for this, founder sponsors, have seen the opportunity. There are others that are there already from Singapore, amongst others Vega Foods, Hiflux, that are seeing the opportunities and are tapping into them. Silvana Jurong was another one that comes to mind. So as far as I'm concerned, ladies and gentlemen, the difference between BRI and AAGC is not one of intention. I think both of them have the basic underlying premise that they want to tap into this wonderful potential presented by in Africa, potential that's becoming more accessible given the access within Africa, the greater the economic integration that will become a reality once all these infrastructure entities become available. China obviously has an advantage in the sense that it has first mover advantage. It currently, in terms of scope and scale, dwarfs the other countries such as India and Japan, and quite a couple of others as well. Madam Chair, I think I've outstayed my welcome. But those are the points that I see as far as the AAGC and the BRI is concerned. I hope Africa never gets put in a position where it needs to choose between the two. And hence my point that I don't see them as clubs, not because they're not necessarily clubs, because I don't want them to be clubs. That was, if they should be, Africa will be the loser. We said that there might be competition, the AAGC for the BRI, and that competition is good. The reality, Africa doesn't have the luxury of choosing, given the fact that they're already quite exposed to all three of these entities. And remember, they do not come on their own. They come with their different supporters. It was interesting to note that although Minister Shanmugam was a great fan of the BRI, if one reads his article on the 29th of August in the Business Times here in Singapore, when you look at the AAGC, Singapore was also visited and was part and parcel of the discussion of the AAGC. So it's going to be a scenario where people will be looking at these two initiatives and see how can we as entities, as countries, as companies benefit from them.
Thank you very much. Okay, that was a good round from all of you. Thank you. I'm going to go into a few questions now, and we will finish at 12, so the audience can actually have their questions as well. When Alfredo was talking, one of the things that came across for me was centrality of China in the BRI. And just kind of thinking about that, my first question actually is going to be to Johan and Hongzhou, okay? And it's centered around the differences and the similarities between the BRI and the AAGC. Now, from everything that has been said, there have obviously been some, differences and some similarities that sort of have been highlighted. Okay, but Hongzhou, could you perhaps focus on telling us a bit about the BRI, okay, and the similarities with the AAGC? And Johan, if you could look at the AAGC and focus on the differences. So you talk about you've talked about it in a sense, so just kind of tell us how is it different from the AAGC, okay? And Johan, very quickly, tell us how it's similar to the AAGC. So Young Hao first, please.
For me, I think one of the biggest difference between BRI and AAGC is that BRI is not just external initiative or international undertaking. More important to China is a domestic economic development strategy. For instance, you have Chinese provinces all has formulated their own plans and priorities to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And in 2017, for instance, the Chinese Xinjiang province plans to invest 200 billion yuan in developing its own infrastructure projects to transforming itself to become the hub of the Silk Road economic belt. The similar case can be found in many other provinces. They all invest, the amount of money they invest in their own provinces and districts is far bigger than the amount of investment they invest overseas, at least as of now. Hence, from Chinese perspective, it's not only a regional economic integration plan, it's also a major domestic economic development initiative aimed to address many of the economic problems face China today. And also many of the political and security problems. For instance, one of the big reasons why China launched the Silk Road economic belt is Xinjiang unrest. Xinjiang, Tibet issues. From 2007 onwards, China has witnessed very violent clashes between the Han Chinese and also the minority groups in Xinjiang, Tibet. Hence, part of the solution, at least from the Chinese leaders' perspective, is that because they believe those extremist movements, separatist movement, and social conflicts can be traced back to poverty, particularly in southern part of Xinjiang. Hence, the solution should be economic development. Investing billions of dollars in southern Xinjiang as a solution to the social and ethnic conflicts in this region.
Thank you.
Thank you, Falaki. If one has a look in terms of the similarities between the two, that's what you want me to address. If you look on the one hand, what the BRI is about, the cooperation priorities is about policy coordination, where it addresses development strategies, policies and plans will have to be aligned, synchronized and negotiated. We're looking at the facilitating connectivity in terms of infrastructure. We're looking at unrestricted and free trade across borders. We're looking at financial integration, and we're looking at strengthening people-to-people contacts. If one has a look at the principles of the AAGC, first of all, the development projects that it will be addressing will be in the field of health and pharmaceuticals, agriculture and agro-processing, disaster management, and skill enhancement. Then, in terms of the very specific aspects, it talks about the existing mechanisms for cooperation between Asia and Africa, the broad-based agenda for synchronized growth of Asia-Africa, for its sustainable innovative development, establishment of optimum linkages and cooperation among the sub-regions of Asia and Africa. There's a whole list. Amongst others, the role of people-to-people partnership in coordination between institutional infrastructure partnerships, etc. The bottom line, if I had taken away the AAGC and added BRI, it would have been the same. And if I'd taken out the BRI and added in the AAGC, it would have been the same. Where they do differ is the fact that as far as the BRI is concerned, Africa is an implicit partner, given the principle of inclusivity. There's no explicit point, Africa, these countries will be involved. The AAGC, in contrast, is very specific in the first phase where it addresses 7 countries on the eastern side of Africa: Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa, and I think Uganda. Whereas then it addresses the 4 in the same phase, the 4 Indian islands, Madagascar, Mauritius, Comoros, and Seychelles. And then in the second phase, it addresses West Africa, Ghana, Gambia, and Cote d'Ivoire. They are then very explicit in how and when they will target Africa. Whereas I said the difference with the AAGC would be, with the BRI would be, is that initiative is kind of addresses 3 countries, but implicit, all given the principle of inclusivity, Africa as a whole can avail itself thereof.
You. It's quite interesting, Hongzhou, a few things I've heard is really telling us a little bit more about the domestic strategy. Obviously, when we really look at, this topic, and of course we're looking at it from Africa, we don't really spend too much time on the domestic strategy. So that's sort of maybe a good one to sort of bring in there and see how, the domestic strategy kind of aligns with other strategies. I really don't want us to, miss out on, if there's anything we want you to leave is with the business opportunities, is knowing what matters in that sense. And, the speakers have highlighted quite a few. In what they've said, there's been there's been agriculture, tourism, manufacturing, energy, ICT, tourism, these are all areas that you really can look at. But my next question really is for Ranveer. And I haven't forgotten, actually, there was a comment that Ranveer gave, which the panel will go to in a minute. It was more about, how the policies, either the AAGC or the BRI, how they really when the rubber hits the road for the businessman, how does it really impact them, and how does it impact? And I think we will get to that. The speakers have said a bit about that. But before that, round there, just considering all that has been said, what opportunities do you think lie for Singapore companies to partner either with the Chinese companies or the Japan and Indian companies in their attempts to venture into Africa?
Thank you. This is exactly the point at which I struggle. I find all these, and I will include the American AGOA Act that they have got. For a businessman, especially let us say a third country businessman, to translate it into a platform of advantage or a point to connect is not easy. So that part is missing clearly. For an interlocution between somebody making this policy, which is clearly aimed at economic development and connectivity, and for a businessman to be able to pick it up and say, yes, I know how it helps my specific focus in business, I have not seen that being so evident. I personally think that perhaps there is a role for Chamber of Commerce, our own federations, to explain to their members how these policies can translate into business opportunities. Up till now, I have not seen anybody taking advantage of it. I had seen bits and pieces, and they're not related to the AAGC. When I used to live in Africa, I had seen Indian government used to have a program of inviting African students for coming for 6-month study trips for IT, for the ICT sector. Now, those could have been used because when those students came back, then the business people could have used them as talent in their businesses. But otherwise, the current AAGC and BRI, I, at this moment, struggle to find how they translate into business opportunity.
Thank you. Dr. Alfredo, this one is for you. Okay, you're an African. Johan and I are Africans as well, and actually the more of us are Africans. You have experience in the Namibian government. In fact, I remember last week you told us about how the first time, well, not the first time, but when you came with the government, and so that really gave a sense of, okay, so you really kind of, not just, you sort of kind of get it in terms of the issues that government might face in Africa. And so, how would you classify the BRI and the AAGC? So we've sort of heard from the panelists, how they will classify it. To what extent can Africa benefit, okay, from both initiatives without having to choose? Johan has sort of alluded to that as well, but I wanted to hear from your view what extent you think that, Africa can benefit from both without having to choose. Bearing in mind all you've told us about China, the kind of the level that each one of these three countries are involved in Africa.
I think I'll slightly build on the point that was raised by Ranveer about times the bigger constructs and businessmen failing to see the opportunity, because I think there's that missing link in terms of articulation as to how opportunities can be accessed. And I think in Africa, you also have, from many governments' perspectives, similar challenges. I brought this magazine deliberately here. It's in French, but basically what it says is that it talks about the new ambitions of China. And then it goes on, Xi, master of the world. And this is really one of the most, if not the leading weekly magazine in France. Meaning that for France, at least from an intellectual as well as from a policy point of view, there are serious attempts to understand China in terms of its objectives, its preferences, and what it sets out to achieve. Now, in Africa, with the exception of South Africa, you would hardly have think tanks or policymakers talking about some of these issues in a manner that is serious. In Singapore, last week in the Straits Times, I saw that almost every other day or every day, I mean, the speech by the Minister of Home Affairs and Law was really deeply analyzed and commended and so forth. The place of Singapore in Obor and and so there is a serious conversation. Now, in many African countries, we don't really know much about where China is going and what it sets out to achieve through Africa. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, I said that Africa is mostly a price taker as opposed to being an active participant. We are not key participants in a number of these initiatives. I think we get the invitation possibly at the end of the road, and we join the fanfare. So that's really a serious challenge that many African governments must deal with, and that is how to meaningfully engage in order to take advantage of the opportunities. There's a final point that I want to raise here, and that is in many African countries, choosing is not a bad thing. I think we have to look at all these deals and see what is best for us. We don't have to be romantic and about these things. And I think for a very long time, especially in the post-colonial era, China comes to Africa. Well, we are friends. We are coming a long way. We never colonized you, so we can offer you a better deal. And at times it turns out not to be the best deal. So there's nothing wrong with choosing. Africa now must be able to choose and say, well, okay, we have a loan of, there's an offer from China, but the Japanese deal looks far better, so we should go for it. Instead of, looking at political considerations. So I think yesterday I saw a very interesting program on TV looking at Indonesia, China, and Japan. And I think it was the foreign minister, or chief minister, or someone who said, well, it had to do with, I think it's a bullet train or something like that, construction, fast-speed train. And I said, well, we looked at those two deals because China offered money and Japan also offered money. And they said, well, we looked at the two critically and we went for the Chinese deal because it spoke to our interests. And I think African countries must get into that space. Djibouti, which is really sort of a magnet in terms of interest from all these key emerging powers and established powers, is in a position now to do that. I think they are doing that. And they're very excited about being able to shop for the best deal. The foreign minister is on record. He said, well, the Chinese have a port. I think 23% of equity in one of the ports. And the foreign minister said, but wait a minute. We also gave an American company a contract to construct an oil pipeline worth $1.4 billion US. And it's not because the Chinese didn't want it, they wanted it as well. But we gave it to the Americans. So that ability to choose is not a bad thing, but you must also choose on the basis of a clear understanding of what our interests are, as opposed to being driven by external preferences. Thank you.
Thank you. In the case of Djibouti, America and China, it's like a marriage with, more than obviously one spouse. But anyhow, the next question is, for all the panelists, and this one's probably an easy one. Okay, it seeks to tease the points of caution for the African continent. I think Dr. Alfredo has just talked a little bit about the need for caution, okay? Now, you're free to answer this as you choose, okay? Not necessarily from a business perspective. This is the question. How would you complete the statement? Africa should be aware of, and then Johan, you can start. So just fill it in. Africa should be aware of.
You mentioned previously I'm your boss. When's performance management time? Yeah. Africa should be aware of caught up in an ideological trap between these different parties. It doesn't have the luxury. It has a considerable part of its how would I put it? Its trade comes from Africa and from China, and not as considerable, but also very large part of its trade is with both China and India and Japan. So it doesn't have the luxury to be caught in an ideological fight between these two institutions. As it is, there's clearly a bit of a discontent between India and China. So from that perspective, Africa has done it in the past where it's sort of part of the underlying movement, and we must keep on looking at this. Tap into these two institutions or these two initiatives to the extent that it can, and then get the benefit thereof. It doesn't have the luxury either of making one of them the preferred provider. I had the interesting question of one of my students, undergrads, a week or two ago, looked at me and he said, I don't understand. I said, what don't you understand? He says, from a business perspective, we are taught at undergrad level that you do not only have one client or one supplier, because then you're extremely vulnerable. He says, what doesn't, we were talking specifically about African countries getting beholden to China. What don't these countries understand about the principle? So it will do them well to diversify. The BRI, given the fact that we're talking about 65 countries, yes, China is a dominant player there, but there's 64, 65 countries that Africa can look at. Ranveer mentioned the AGOA. So, and we're looking at Germany with its Marshall Plan. So Africa needs to cast its net wide, globally, and look at its partners, investment and trade from all over the world and not only in one specific region.
Thank you very much. And Ranveer?
Thank you. Africa should be clear about its interests, and I would say it should be deaf about any other plan, any other policy which does not address its own interests. So what should it be wary of? Listening to all these plans coming through, which are only addressing the needs and requirements of those countries. If I were just to look at the business framework, what do we need? When I go to a country, I will look at the language they speak. I will look at what is the legal framework. Legal framework, when I sign a contract, what do I sign at the bottom? Arbitration acceptable in the court of London or Shanghai or Mumbai. So I start understanding what is my framework. If any of these policies is bringing any confusion to my operative framework, I'll be wary of that. People want to come and make infrastructure, they want to bring in developmental finance, very good, as long as it fits my interest as Africa. Africa should be aware of its interest and wary of anything that does not meet its own interest.
Thank you very much. And Alfredo?
Yeah, I think there are elements of continuity, with the two previous speakers. Africa should be really careful about an externally driven agenda of development. Because what we have seen, economies are growing, but the growth has not been inclusive. So there's a need for Africa to take a very internal view of what development should be all about. So I think it's something, that from where I see it is an area of concern and where Africa should really deepen the conversation.
I think from the African countries' point of view, there should be worry of the debt risk. Right now, a lot of discussion about the risk of Chinese companies investing in Belt and Road projects. But if you look at the statistics, the Chinese company last year invested about I think it's about $14.5 billion in Belt and Road countries. But if you look at the amounting so-called number of projects, the total value of the projects project contracts won by the Chinese companies is about 7 to 8 times higher than the than the outward foreign direct investment, which means that instead of being direct investors of those BRI projects, Chinese companies, in many cases, in most cases, are just contractors. Of course, with loans and financial aids from different Chinese institutes, banks. Hence, the risk, many of the one who bears the risk of these projects are quite often the host countries, Southeast Asian countries, African countries. In this regard, I think African countries has to be very careful, at least in choosing which project to move forward. The feasibility study needs to be through, and need to understand ability to project the future demands and preface costs for various projects before you sign up, just because the money is there.
Thank you. And I think we've maybe got time just for one more question before we hand it over to the audience. And it's probably a nice way, and just from what Hongzhou just talked about, I think one question that I really have is, definitely China is, financing most of the infrastructure developments in Africa. The panel has sort of made it clear that there are benefits to that. In fact, maybe if we want to look at some kind of a correlation with business, it will be how it makes it easier for Olam to transport agriculture to other parts, for example. So that, could be one. But, my question is, can Africa repay these loans? And how will it repay the loans? Okay, so we're sort of ending more on finance. Examples, of course, that we've said: Nairobi, Mombasa, the Addis Ababa, Djibouti railway lines, Kenya, Ethiopia, Angola, all involved. Can Africa repay these loans? I think one of you did talk about the risk. Somebody, it might have been Alfredo, also mentioned this, and I just want to kind of hear from all of you very, very quickly, really. This should be like a 20-second answer, okay? Can Africa repay the loans, and how will it repay the loans? And this time I'm going to start from Hongzhou.
The quick question is, I don't know. It's perhaps, if I may add, it depends on different countries' particular situations, and also the particular projects. A lot of issues, but there's a risk there for sure. And perhaps in the past, I think the past model is that in many of the cases is the aid for resource kind of deal. The same kind of deal has, in the past, several years ago, is also been struck but later cancelled between China and Thailand, the high-speed rail for rice deal. But this kind of deal has a lot of risk, so of course creates a lot of social and political concerns in the host countries.
Yeah, I don't know how true it is, but the former president of China, Hu Jintao, is alleged to have said that it is easier for us to buy Taiwan as opposed to invading it. Now, on the question of debt, many African countries today are becoming newly indebted. And in the process, they would have to give up some of the jewels in their own crowns. And I think that is, for example, giving up on some strategic resources. So I think there is a pattern that is worrying. And it's not only worrying Africans who are interested in these questions, but also some of the old countries that have been, playing the game of debt for a very long time. So I think it is something of concern, and I don't think that there would be an easy way out, especially in light of some of the promises that governments make. They need the money to live up to their electoral promises. So in the process, I think they in the long term, there are serious challenges. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would refer back about 14 years ago. So there was an article which said that US private and state capital, about $300 billion had been invested in China. And at that time, the question was, will people get that money back? Will they get a return on it? Do you think that was a valid question when you look back today? So I think the world of finance, project finance and corporate finance and government project finance has moved along a lot. A lot of this capital is very safe. It will have a return through growing size of economy in Africa. The type of capital that I don't really understand, and US must have put a few $1 billion in Afghanistan. What is the return on that? This is very positive capital. What is being put, there will be a return for that. I have no fear for it.
And I think one needs to be careful not to look at Africa as a whole, because you're going to find some countries in severe problems. Mozambique already is defaulting. And then you're going to find other countries that are not in that position. My country, South Africa, is very much fast in the pace of getting junk bond status from all three ratings agencies. So it will be interesting to see how they will deal with it. But a couple of the countries other countries in Africa, you do find relatively low government debt to GDP ratios, which then tells you there is debt capacity. And I would like to sort of latch on to a point that Ranveer made, and that is as far as growing economies are concerned. The hope is that the participation of an India, a China, a Japan, and all the other sort of countries, we've never mentioned South Korea, will have a leverage effect, that there would be more money being spent and invested, the greater connectivity, would lead to greater trade, would lead to greater manufacturing, greater industrialization, greater employment, more middle class, more money being spent, greater government revenues. So if we have this flywheel of hope, then, which is very much a strong possibility, and we see that happening in a couple of the countries, then it is, I think, quite an open and shut case. Yes, those African countries that are able to latch onto this kind of initiative and this movement of leveraging, creating a safer environment, drawing more money in, more tourists, etc., we will have a positive benefit from that.
Thank you very much, and we've run out of time. So I'm just going to really just literally spend 1 minute to kind of just put together what has really been said, and then open it up to the audience. And I really just want to hinge it around Alfredo's conclusions, right? So the first thing he said was 3 major economies putting their bet on Africa. Okay, it's good for Africa. Okay, it makes people sit up and think about Africa. These are obviously not just economic initiatives, they are geopolitical constructs as well. So if you're going in there, go with your eyes open, know what's in there for you, and try and get that. And I think maybe, especially for businesses, I think one of the things he said was Africa is no longer, money isn't the problem really in Africa. It's a question of you being creative, innovative, and accessing these resources. So kind of from everything that they've said, what I'm guessing is tap on these initiatives. I think being in Southeast Asia, we get OBO. Hopefully we'll get AAGC as well, but we get it. We get it better than so many other places. And like Alfredo said, in Africa, those conversations are not quite there. So, this is one thing, and, definitely keep the conversation going. So we are going to keep it going, and I'm going to open it now to the audience. If you please, could you just put up your hands and tell us your name, your affiliation, and which member of the panel you want to direct your question to. Thank you. Can I maybe have a show of hands, please? Questions in the audience? Okay, so 3 for now, yeah. So, yes, we go ahead. Prof. Ravi.
My question is for Dr. Hangari. You were an advisor to the Namibian president at one time. What is the development plan of Namibia? And given the priorities that Namibia may have, how do you engage in, say, an AAGC or a BRI? I would think that was the way to go about looking at how to participate in these efforts by other countries to invest in Namibia, rather than China trying to sell you a fast train who you couldn't care less about. Well, no, that may not be the value that you want as priority. Or participating in a populist election and saying, this is what I want to give my people because that's what voted me in. That may not be of the best priority for the development of the country. Now, how would a country like Namibia go about doing this?
Yes, I think when it comes to plans, I don't think that there is a shortage of that in Africa and in many African ministries. The Namibian government has got a national development plan since independence to make the country an industrialized one by 2030. We are in 2017 and don't see that happening. Last year, the president launched sort of a short to medium term impact plan that would try and look at dealing with the middle income trap within where Namibia is finding itself. And of course, within all these plans, China became a very important actor, especially from the year 2000. And I think that's really the key year for China in Africa. And what we have seen, of course, some major infrastructure projects, some of them riddled with a lot of corruption. And the question of quality also became a key matter in the equation. But I think Namibia is too small for some of these actors, especially China. Japan has been a very minimalist participant. And the Japanese ambassador last year, he said, well, we really don't know how to operate in Africa, unlike our Chinese friends, because, the question of speed for the Japanese is a concern. India has been, of course, very active in Namibia, and the Namibian government has benefited immensely from some of the low technology transfers from India, as well as training in higher education and so forth. So there are elements, but I think there are a lot needs still to be done by the Namibian government in order to meaningfully tap in a far more structured way from the relationships.
Thank you.
Thank you. I always have a reservation on this OBOR or BIR or AAGC, but I think they are all self-fulfilling for the promoters or the originators of these ideas. I would have felt that these initiatives would have been better served for Africa if they somehow connected back to the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. I think this is where Africa needs the most help. I think Hongzhu, I think, mentioned that what would it serve? I mean, is development the cure for the issues in Africa? And I think the Millennium Development Goals set out by the UN and for Africa, I think these are the ones that need to be addressed. And if this initiative somehow dovetail into that, I think would have been more meaningful. Africa has 40% of Africa is poverty. I mean, 40% poverty, nearly 30% unemployment rate. And I think the Millennium Goals were trying to address that, among many other things. Empowerment for women, health issues, such, climate, sustainability, all kind of water, portability. But I don't think these initiatives that we see here, the BIR or the AAGC, and what they are intending to do will actually resolve those issues. And if, in fact, I see these initiatives as another form of colonization of Africa. I think the African Union should have come out with a bolder plan on what they wish to do for themselves, because I think you mentioned that in the interest of Africans, I think you mentioned, what is your interest? What is Africa's interest? And I think if the African Union can't come out with a plan, I mean, you want China, India, Japan, or whoever is to come and sort out you are not going to resolve these problems. You will still be caught in a flux. So I personally feel that these are initiatives that are meant for, I think, political reasons. I think there is a great vacuum in Africa after the United States and Europeans moved out, and I think China found, and India found, or Japan is finding space to consolidate political control over a huge mass of property that's lying in the continent, and there are 54 countries. And when we talk about Africa, I think we should talk only about a few countries in Africa, not the continent itself, because it's so diverse. So I leave this thought with the panel and see if what you think of this comment that I have made, whether the UN Millennium Development Goal would have been much more better, or these initiatives would have been better served if actually they converge with the Millennium Development Goals. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to kind of let Dr. Alfredo and Johan maybe try and tackle that first, and then we'll see if anybody else wants to do that.
Ambassador, yes, very good point that you make. I think the reality is in the world today, people do things for love of money. So if there's no return, then they are sort of hesitant to look that way. We must give the AAGC credit, however. They actually link the sustainable the SDGs, they actually link it to their initiative, SDGs having overtaken the Millennium Development Goals. So they actually make the point that AAC-led growth in Africa and Asia will be responsive to the collective commitment for the Sustainable Development Goals. So that as far as the AAGC is concerned. To what extent it will eventually pan out remains to be seen. It's very early days. As an entity, the AAGC is not yet active. As the two players, Japan and India, is concerned, yes, how the rest of the others will pan out and sort of get their directly involved, it's a different issue. But you make a very valid point. Unless they actively strive towards not only the SDGs, but also the Agenda 2063 and also the high 5 priorities of the African Development Bank, then it's going to be senseless, because they do underwrite the need for Africa. And all the different initiatives need to adapt to these and embrace them as direction-given sort of purposes.
I think it's a valid point about at times how far some of these constructs could be from ordinary preoccupations. Because even the African Union itself launched with great fanfare, I think it's 2 years ago or so, Agenda 2063, which is quite ambitious. It talks about how Africa will look like in 2063, possibly something better, far better than Singapore, what Singapore is today. But the critical question is, there are no resources to live up to that agenda. So what you do have is that relying a whole lot on the external partners to drive your agenda. And I think as you pointed out, at times when it's external, it becomes a matter of these actors choosing the assets that they want to own on the continent. And there's no doubt about the fact that China has been choosing up when it comes to the assets that it wants to own, both symbolic as well as the ordinary hardcore infrastructure. In Namibia, it owns the State House, for example. The State House in Namibia, where the president lives, was built with Chinese money. It's a loan from China. And I think a significant part of it has also been written off. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa was constructed with Chinese money. So that's a very symbolic asset, and it's very difficult it becomes very difficult for African countries to say no to China, because you are reminded about the place where you are meeting, you know. So I think we are facing some serious challenges, yes, in that sense.
I just want to add a very quick thought, still, along the moving object. I think even for the OBOR, because if you listen to, I think, the translation of the speech of Xi Jinping very recently, you find out that a lot of things are slotted kind of into it, which maybe wasn't kind of at the forefront. I think when you think about OBOR, you think about trade, you think about infrastructure, but apparently now they're trying to get you to begin to think about some of the but some of these other issues, that you rightly raised. And you don't have to answer a panel, but just kind of in line with this, Johan talked about the responsive. So one of the things about the AAGC is it tries to, say, look, we are really actually about sustainable development. And if you read the vision document, you will see that it says it seeks to be responsive to the Sustainable Development Goals. And India goes on to give examples of initiations that it has done for example, the International Solar Alliance. And it's also, pitched itself as having developmental programs in clean energy. And then you see the use of words like Digital India, Skill India, Smart City. And one thing I thought for the panel really was, what is Africa doing in these areas? And more importantly, AAGC also is giving the impression that, look, we are going to be more consultative. We're going to speak to more people. And I thought it would just be interesting to know, what developmental experiences from Africa can serve as a great example for cooperation. But you don't have to answer that because, we still have more questions from the audience. But just a thought for every one of us, So many times we look at Africa and all that we can give to Africa. In the process of giving everything to Africa, Africa is actually taking some things as well. And so it's sometimes useful to take a pause and find out, okay, from everything we've given to Africa, what can they give back to us? So lessons, in a way, okay? But Moses, I think you had a question.
At this point, everyone knows that Africa has a huge and massive presence. Sorry, China has a massive presence in Africa, but and they're putting up a lot of infrastructure. But we're still seeing Africa being an exporter of raw products. And in this case, if you're to say the major avenues where China is, they're still exporting raw products. So what I'm asking is, with the AAGC and the Africa-China partnership, will Africa benefit more from this, or it's just on paper, as like what we're seeing right now, no major manufacturing and value addition establishments are being put in the African countries where this corridor passes?
Do you have anyone in particular on the panel you've addressed the question to, or?
Maybe Dr. Alfredo.
Oh, okay.
It would be a good question for Johan. But
The walking, shall I take it? Moses, yes, I think we're always going to find the scenario that there are export opportunities of raw commodities. We've had the oil export countries of the world, of Africa in any case, doing exactly that. The lesson that they've learned now is that it doesn't help to just export commodities. They need to grow and develop, and both of them, both of Angola and Nigeria, have made the diversification of the economies and focusing stronger on agriculture a hallmark of the diversification process, given the harsh lessons that they've learned. It's going to take time. The attraction has always been it's easy money to make, to export. You know, it's tragic that countries such as Nigeria have 4 government refineries, none of them work. They export to, amongst others, here it gets refined and they buy them back at increased price. So we are finding that the president of China in 2015's FOCAC actually made the point, is that they will encourage value add at source. And what it's currently also doing in Ethiopia, amongst others, it is encouraging Chinese companies at the bottom end of the value addition spectrum to transfer their manufacturing activities from China to African countries, amongst others then Ethiopia, where you now find textiles being produced by Chinese companies, and where you find large Western corporations, H&M, PVH from the US, manufacturing and sourcing from Ethiopia. So but it's going to be a process, that it's not going to happen overnight. They need the money, which they will get if they can get their oil price up. So it's going to take a while. What they do need to be careful of is looking at value addition for the sake of value addition. South Africa is a case in point where ArcelorMittal are manufacturing steel and exporting it as a loss. And they are in serious trouble. They have their iron ore, they manufacture, or they created the factory in Saldanha Bay, where they then manufacture certain steel products. And they're not making money. So Africa's going to be careful as well as to what sectors of the economy will they be adding value. There's a lot that they can look at a great sort of benefit to them. And amongst others in the agriculture sector, which Ranveer knows far more than I do. So I'm giving you a kind of a dual answer here. I hope I have answered your question.
And then Ranveer?
I'll make a related comment. Let us put one more filter. I obviously like when I read the American Act, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, I like it. It is talking about all these governance things and about improvement of governance and labor policies in Africa and for the access of the American market for the African goods. But in a manner, if you put one filter, it is slightly patronizing. They are there to do good. Now, China, India, you would expect them to be in a very different frame. They are developing their own economies. They have their own poor sectors and poor regions and poor people, and they're developing that for themselves. China needs the raw material from Africa. It needs to create jobs in its own country. It needs to build its own economy. And the filter I will put over there is that's a more mature interaction. The language from there is that I know how to take care of my interest. I hope you know how to take care of your interest. And somewhere I find that the discussions related to Africa get very prickly. We have to just transport ourselves back 50 years or whatever, 70 years of World War II, when whole of Europe was devastated, Japan was in shambles, and they were built on American goodwill and finance and everything. Did America gain out of it? Yes. But Europe and Japan built themselves out of ruins from there. Do we look at them and feel sorry for them? Not at all. Very strong economies today. They knew how to take the foreign policies and foreign finance and develop out of there. So there's a part Africa has to do for itself. And this session here is to compare what is the Chinese policy, the BRI, what is the Indian and the Japanese AAGC program. Will it help Africa? How should Africa look at it? They are not a full solution for African development. They address the needs of two regions, Africa and China in one case, and Africa and India, Japan in the other case.
Thank you. And I think Mr. Rontan, is Mr. Rontan in the building? Okay. Last week, you had a question, and I remember Johan saying, hold on to this week. So maybe this is a good time to ask that question to the panel.
Good morning to the panel. I'm Ron Tan. Basically, China is already in Africa. So with the One Belt, One Road initiative, it's a conceptual plan. Probably it is for Africa to industrialize first, then to tap onto the market of One Belt, One Road, where there are about 660 over countries. The other one is, I'd like to mention is Dr. Hungary, the countries that members of One Belt, One Road. First one is Egypt. I think based on the Silk Road, Tanzania, Kenya is included through the Suez Canal. That's based on the 21st century maritime Silk Road. From the port of Lamu to Dar es Salaam, then upwards to Djibouti, Egypt. But officially, I think it's only Egypt is in the maritime Silk Road. But based on the land road, then it's only one country, that's Egypt. But then on the corridor of the Suez Canal, then probably you have a few more countries, including Ethiopia, Somalia, and Sudan. Thank you.
Maybe very quickly, who would like to?
I think as of now, of course, the officials' position to at Belt and Road Initiative is that it's open to all countries. Of course, some department and the Chinese officially affiliated think tanks come out with a list of names of countries that are involved in the Belt Road projects. But right now, I think for African countries, 4 African countries are included: Egypt, Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And perhaps I would like to take this opportunity to comment on the manufacturing question and also the colonization question, perhaps quickly. I think, as I mentioned in my brief talk, right now, among the Chinese companies, 1/3 are in the manufacturing sectors. And in the past few years, you see the number of investment, or volume of investment in the manufacturing sector as share of Chinese total investment in Africa is picking up. And according to the former chief economist of the World Bank, Justin Lin, he said as Chinese economy is graduating from a low-skill manufacturing sector to high value-added ones, this process will free up 100 million labor-intensive manufacturing jobs. And in the past few years, we already witnessed many of the Chinese companies are relocating to Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and in Africa as well. So with the implementation of the Belt and Road project, this process will accelerate, and you will see more Chinese manufacturing plants, or Chinese investors investing in the manufacturing sectors in Africa. And for the point about whether the Belt and Road Initiative is a geopolitical construct or an effort, China's colonization effort, I don't, at least from my own perspective, I don't really see it as effort or push by China to colonize Africa or Southeast Asia or any part of this or the Belt Road regions. Initially, as I mentioned earlier, it was a diplomatic initiative under Chinese President Xi Jinping to build better ties with the focus on economic cooperation. The goal is to build better ties between China, Central Asia, and China, Southeast Asia. But later on, it was expanded both domestically and internationally because China sees it as a solution to many of the problems it faces both internationally and domestically. Hence, the Belt and Road Initiative at the current form, at least from my own view, is a regional economic integration effort focus with the key focus on infrastructure, trade, policy, finance, policy coordination. But of course, it will have, given the ambitious scale of this project, the Belt and Road Initiative, it will have huge geopolitical consequences. But still, I think the colonization is not China's plan to colonize. And perhaps what we may recall a few years ago in 2007, when during the global food crisis, you have a lot of media reports about China is colonizing Africa, purchasing or leasing large quantity of land in Africa just to feed its own population. But we all know after serious studies from different institutes, all these kind of media reports are not really supported by the facts on the ground. They're just media hypes. Thanks.
I just wanted to take you on briefly on that point of, I don't think that you are going to have a form of colonialism that was practiced in the past, I think, but you do have what is clearly a very hegemonic project on the part of China in Africa. And I think that the fact that 10,000 Chinese soldiers could, by the end of this year, they could be sitting in Djibouti, in China's first military base outside the country, I think it's a very clear but worrying signal. And I think China has also requested other African countries on the South Atlantic coast for bases, and some of them have refused. So I think you do have a project that is political, economic, and I think the end of it, we are yet to see what it's going to be like. But of course, certainly not colonialism of the Western European type.
Yeah, and in fact, to that question of how they will repay, and if they can, people are talking about political concessions, economic concessions, and all those things kind of in there. Is there one more pressing question? We've really come to the end, but I was just wondering if there's one more pressing. Okay. Okay. Very, very quickly. Yeah.
Mine is a remark. Basically, for all those infrastructure work that China does, Africa have a lot of raw materials that I think China is aiming to barter for it, like your bauxite, raw material, blah, blah, gold, diamond, you have plenty of that. The other comment that I want to say is regarding Mr. Ranvir's comment on the gap between the policies and the business that we as a SME or business to actually get the business in terms of either you sell something or you distribute something within the continent. So this is very challenging in Africa, based on my own experience, between the policy that wanting for services or product, at the same time a businessman trying to sell something there, especially to government department, is very challenging. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've come to the end of this panel discussion, and I probably just want you to leave with four, maybe 5 things, okay? The opportunities are definitely there. Agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, even financing, infrastructure, these are areas. There's the need to tread with caution. The need to incorporate sustainable development goals and look for those opportunities as well, because many countries will want to kind of address that. The need to think of Africa's development strategy, and also, of course, the challenges that some of the panelists have sort of highlighted here, and the need for self-interest. So on that note, I'm just going to ask that you all please thank this panel, okay, and actually thank yourselves as well for a good discussion. Thank you. And I'm just going to just very quickly present a gift, a token to the panelists.